recording. Good. Yeah. It's always kind of annoying when I have a whole session and didn't get recorded. Okay, so we're going to continue on our new topic of free will and determinism. Okay. Yeah, review a little bit, but so far I've tried to just, what you have in front of you right here. Yes, it organizes the whole presentation, but it also allows you to sort of see all the different issues that are related to this topic, right? Free will and determinism. So, for example, we looked at the way in which free will is connected to morality, right? That it makes a difference to us whether or not somebody did something of their own free will, or if it was an accident, or if somebody else forced them to do it, right? Or if it was some sort of bodily function that you can't help, right? That matters to us. There's a difference between somebody who does something that we consider to be destructive or bad in some way, someone who does it intentionally on purpose because they mean to, and someone who does it for some other reason, where we would say it wasn't of their own free will. And now we looked at this in the context of morality, just everyday situations, right? I'm asking you to sort of think about that for yourself, when you've dealt with other people and ways that they've behaved that maybe you didn't like. It does make a difference, doesn't it? Whether or not they did it of their own free will. Where we're not really too worried about what exactly free will entails here metaphysically, it is more rather in our everyday practices, we make that kind of distinction. We look at someone's behaviors or actions, and we ask whether or not those behaviors and actions are a result of the person's own intentions and whether they meant to do it. Things like that. This comes up in legal context as well, doesn't it? It's a huge thing, right? Premeditated murder is very different from other types, right? We make all these sorts of legal distinctions that have to do with the person's psychological states when they are performing the action. And it's very important to establish that the person doing the action did it freely of their own accord, of their own free will. And if they didn't, then that changes the law. That changes the outcome of whatever the legal case may be. It makes a difference. So at least at a folk psychology level, right, we do make these kinds of distinctions. Even if we don't always use the word free will, right? All we're saying here is that when it comes to morality, when it comes to the way in which we judge each other's and the way in which we judge someone's behavior and whether or not they should be punished for it, that all depends on whether or not we see that person as a free, responsible agent who can be held accountable for their actions because they are the ones choosing those actions and they're not being forced to or anything like that, right? This sort of an everyday notion of free will. And notice that this does not necessarily mean that you have some distinct idea of what free will really is, right? As though it's some sort of metaphysical ability that you have. We're not usually all that worried about it. It's mostly about distinguishing one type of action from another type of action, right? Using terms like free will, voluntarily, of their own accord, things like that, right? So just at a very folk psychology level, I'm trying to get you to recognize free will and related notions play a role in our everyday ordinary practices of moral evaluation and also in legal practices, legal evaluation, right? So the idea of free will seems to be very important. This leaves it open that free will doesn't exist. It leaves it open that free will is not even a coherent notion. It leaves open all sorts of possibilities. All we're saying here is, well, this is something we do, right? We make this distinction. Yeah. And people have struggled with the problem of determinism, right? The problem that determinism creates for this notion of free will. We think free will entails that we are somehow free, rational, decision makers who are able to choose from among different options. But the idea of determinism, which says that every event is causally necessitated by prior events, right? At least there seems to be some sort of tension between that idea and the idea of free will. And that's all we've said so far. Is that, yeah, when you start talking about determinism, when you start talking about just the physical world around us and how everything that happens because something else happened, right? This is how we explain things in everyday contexts. Why did that happen, right? Why did that country flood? Well, we can look at earthquakes that caused seismic upheavals or something like that. Or you can think about why there's coffee all over the floor. Well, somebody spilled something. There's always some sort of causal story that we can tell for why something had to happen the way that it did. Yes, and that's what we're going to look at the very end, Parker. So just notice that little area called compatibilism, right? That's what that is, yeah. That's the view that there isn't actually any real logical tension, okay? That's the view that free will is not dependent on determinism being false. That you can have free will even if determinism is true. That's compatibilism. So yeah, good that you asked that, and that's definitely an option. People often take there to be only two options, right? That between determinism and free will, they can't both be true, right? That's what makes someone an incompatibilist. So most people outside of philosophy who have given this idea some thought tend to be incompatibilists. People think, yes, if determinism is true, then we don't have free will. Or conversely, if we have free will, that must mean determinism is false. So that's incompatibilism. So depending on which way you lean, right? Do you think free will? Do we really have free will, and so therefore determinism is false? Well, then you're a libertarian. If, on the other hand, you think determinism is true, and therefore free will is false, then you're a hard determinist. If you think they can both be true, then you're a compatibilist. Sometimes that's called a soft determinist. Because notice, the compatibilist is still a determinist. The compatibilist does not waffle on that, does not hedge on that. The compatibilist, the usual compatibilist, is a full determinist. Determinism is true on that view. It's just that if we consider our concept of free will, they argue, we can have a perfectly good notion of free will that can play a part in our ordinary moral practices, in our ordinary legal practices, that just simply does not have to involve determinism being false. Free will and determinism can both be true on this view. We can have a perfectly good concept of free will even within a deterministic universe. That's the idea. And so, just to recap determinism, when you look at it just purely in terms of physics and physical causes, it's pretty easy to explain. Every physical event has some physical cause. Right? And that physical cause necessitates the outcome. It means that if those circumstances are in place, then the next thing necessarily happens, right? I kept doing this example over and over of having a pen or some other object roll down some sort of incline. Right? If you have all the physical factors exactly the same, then that object will roll down the incline in exactly the same way every time, as long as all the factors are exactly the same. Right? That means its path down the incline is causally necessitated. It is made necessary by all those physical factors. So determinism just extrapolates from everyday examples to, well, guess what? Everything in the world is like that. The entire configuration of the entire universe at this moment is inevitable. The world had to be like this, given what the world was like a few moments ago and the laws of physics that everything obeys. Right? If the laws of physics are truly universal, right? If every single atom obeys these universal laws of physics, then it makes sense to say that every position of every atom is completely determined by every position of every atom a moment before, and that by a moment before that, and that by a moment before that. So that you can even think of it in this way. Think of the Big Bang, think of the universe as this infinitesimally small point in space. Everything that happens after that is already causally determined by that state of the universe at that moment. So everything you're doing is included in that, right? Your entire life is completely determined by all the physical factors that have happened in the past. Because you are a physical organism, you are a physical being just like everything else in the world. If every physical thing in the universe obeys these physical laws, where everything that happens now causally necessitates what happens next, your actions are no different. It may feel like, well, I came up with this, but then as we see in psychological determinism, like, well, yeah, maybe your actions are the result of your beliefs and your desires, but where do those beliefs and desires ultimately come from? In some ultimate sense, that's beyond your control. We looked at ways in which you can, get meta about your own beliefs and desires. And in a way, that's what philosophy asks you to do, right? So there's an extent to which you have some amount of freedom to say, well, I want to have different values or different desires from the ones that I have, right? So, for example, a drug addict might wake up one day and say, I wish I could just work on myself to get different desires. What if I connected more with my community and my friends and I just developed a different set of desires, that not ones that always lead me to using drugs? That's a possibility, right? Whether or not somebody does that, however, that's going to be dependent on what kind of life that person has had in the past, and what kind of mental outlook they have in general, which is going to be partly determined by genetics and partly by your environment. So we can look at determinism purely physically or psychologically. And when we look at it at a psychological level, it is just the insight that, well, whatever you're doing, you think you're doing of your own free will, okay, but the kind of psychological profile that you have, which is the thing that made you take that action, that's overall psychological profile is ultimately outside of your control. Because it's explainable in terms of things that are outside of your control, right? Namely, your genetic makeup that predisposes you, right? It predisposes you. Now, there's lots of interesting, complicating factors about genetics and epigenetics, and there's, it's a complicated story that we can tell. But the overall insight is that when human beings are born as babies, as we are born, right? Every person has a unique genetic makeup. And that unique genetic makeup predisposes them towards certain things and certain behaviors. Right? Some genetic predispositions are things like hair color and eye color and things like that. Some genetic predispositions make you not be able to see very well without glasses, like me. Right? There are other genetic predispositions that make a person more open to new experiences than others. Some genetic predispositions make some children have a harder time falling asleep when they're children. Right? There's all sorts of little things like that that can have a long-term impact, right? Imagine a child who's never able to get enough sleep when they're young, right? That can have an impact on the way their brains develop. There's all sorts of complicated ways in which this happens, but the overall thing is the same in each case. What type of person you are is going to be largely determined by what kind of predispositions you have that are based on your genetics, and then what kinds of life experiences you've had throughout your whole entire life. Okay? And if you're lucky, then you are exposed to a kind of an idea, as you're being exposed to right here, that you are actually able to take some control over your desires and your values and your beliefs. But again, whether or not you take that control is outside of your control. It's a weird psychological paradox. Okay. And I said, well, so this is all about determinism, right? That every event is caused by previous events. And so for psychological determinism, that just means each of your behaviors, each of your actions is determined by your psychological profile. Your psychological profile is determined by all those things we just talked about. Well, we could also take a different approach. Why should we think determinism is true? Well, what would the alternative look like? The alternative to determinism is indeterminism, which means that some things can just happen without any causal explanation at all, right? And that, to many people, looks intuitively implausible. Isn't that kind of weird? Why would there be some actions that do not stand in any kind of causal relationship to anything, or to anything prior? That seems like a strange sort of thing. When we look at any other kind of events, we can always tell some sort of causal story about all the things that led to that event. If indeterminism is true, that means that there are certain actions that you do for which you can tell no kind of story, no kind of causal story for how you ended up doing that action. Maybe that's not a hugely strong argument, but I kind of think the more you think about indeterminism, the more problematic that is. That's more problematic than determinism, I think. Okay. So this is all review so far. We looked at all of this. Now we're going to look at incompatibilism. We give Parker a second to finish typing. By the way, last time when I did the thing, I did the mic drop. Remember that, to show gravity and make a point about determinism, and accidentally put the mic back up into my mic holder, which is a cup, and so the rest of the lecture was muffled. If you hear it later, it's kind of ridiculous. Yeah, so randomness is going to come up a little bit, right? Randomness, there's at least two ways of understanding what random is. And we can tie this directly back to two of the main branches of philosophy: metaphysics and epistemology. Metaphysics has to do with what's real. Epistemology has to do with what we know. So random can mean that reality in itself is in some way random and unorganized and chaotic, such that there are certain things that happen without any logical, rational, principled explanation. Things just happen. That's metaphysical randomness. But then there's also epistemological randomness, and that just has to do with predictability. Right, so when you imagine the lotto, the lotto thing where you have all the balls that are rolling around, for us, it's random, right? Otherwise, we would just know which lotto numbers to pick, right? We just wait for the little ball to pop out, and it'll show a number. To us, it's random. Metaphysically, it's not random, right? If you knew exactly what all the balls, what all their mass was, what all the sort of convections and things were happening inside of the machine that pops out these balls, if you knew enough of the physical factors, it would all be predictable. It would not be random. So what kind of random are we talking about? Are we talking about what is to us unpredictable? Or what is truly metaphysically chaotic and random, right? Most of the time when you and I are talking about unpredictable, it just means, or when you and I talk about randomness, we're mostly talking about unpredictableness, right? So can random exist without a lack of multiple possibilities and independent realities? Possibly not metaphysical randomness, but epistemological randomness to us, yeah, that can always exist as long as we have finite minds that can't predict anything, can't predict everything, right? Okay, let me see what else you're saying. Yeah, arbitrary. Yeah. Yeah, so what Parker is pointing to here is an important distinction to make. Right? That a lot of times we call things random because we are unable to predict the result. Yeah. This is going to come up in quantum indeterminacy, right? That's the idea that at the quantum level, the very small level, not everything is determined. There's some level of unpredictability. But here, how are you going to interpret that? And physicists disagree. Many physicists say that it is actually just epistemological randomness or indeterminacy. We're not always able to predict what's going to happen. That does not mean that the universe itself is inherently unpredictable and chaotic, right? That may simply reflect something about our minds and about our inability to predict everything. So these are good things to keep in mind, and this will come up again. So Parker, I'm going to keep going now, but actually these issues will come back up. Yeah. It's going to come up mostly when we talk about quantum indeterminacy, right? Where there's that same kind of ambiguity between the two kinds of randomness or the two kinds of indeterminacy. Okay, so here's an argument for incompatibilism. Anyone could come up with this argument, and it underlies many of people's the intuitions that many people have about this topic. So this is, I'm giving you Gary Watson's formulation of this. Gary Watson has done a lot of work on the issue of compatibilism and incompatibilism, free will, determinism. This is his argument. Okay, premise 1, if determinism is true, then all events are causally necessitated by prior states of the universe in accordance with the law of nature. Is that premise true? I'm going to say this is analytically true. Remember analytic truths? You can know analytic truths a priori because they're true by definition. This is simply telling us the definition of determinism. That's what determinism means, right? So this premise, I take it that we can all accept this premise as being true. Determinism means that all events are causally necessitated by prior states of the universe, according to these universal laws of physics. Sorry, I have a very itchy nose. Premise number 1, then, I think is not that controversial. Okay, this is simply telling us what determinism means. It's one way of looking at it, anyway. Second premise is, if human actions, which again would be part of all events, right? If human actions are causally necessitated, and again, necessitated means if all this stuff happens, then this has to happen. Right? So if there's a cause to your behavior, to your actions, that means that as long as you have that cause in place and everything else in the universe is exactly the same as well, then you are going to behave in that way, right? So that means for every event, there is some necessary cause, some cause that should it be there, that's enough for the effect to happen. Right. So if that's true, if human actions are causally necessitated by previous events in the past, then we cannot do other than what we do. Right? There are no alternate possibilities. Does everyone see that? So this one is, this is not just necessarily an analytic statement as clear as the first one. Right? But it's trying to say that if human actions are causally necessitated, that means there are no alternate possibilities. Necessary means it has to be that way, right? So if take any of your actions that you did that maybe you thought was free will, well, if that action was actually made necessary by everything that happened in the past, meaning it's inevitable, then you couldn't have really done anything other than what you did. You don't have alternate possibilities on that view, right? Everyone following along so far? It's the same as, pull out this old chestnut again, right? if all the factors, right, if we could list all the factors involved in the physics of this situation, right, the mechanics of it, the angle of this incline, the surface texture, the mass of the pen, the shape of the pen, the gravitational pull, all of it, right, then this set of causes necessarily leads to the pen falling exactly there. And if all those causes are in place again, all the exact same causes, it'll fall there again and again and again. There are no alternate possibilities for this pen. Right? If all the physical circumstances are exactly the same, then they would be aligned in exactly the same way, and that would result in exactly the same end results every time. There are no alternate possibilities for the pen, for sure, right? All these physical factors causally necessitate what's going to happen to the pen. So even if the pen thinks to itself, I think I'd like to land over there, right? It's deluding itself. It was going to land there regardless, right? All the physical factors are in place, so it is going to land there. So if human actions are like that as well, then of course, even though you may have thought, oh, well, I'm using my free will to show up to class today. Nope. Right? If your actions are causally necessitated by the past, then this is the only thing that you are going to do. You might call it a choice, but in some sense it's not, right? Now I'm saying in some sense, and I'm trying to motivate this point of view, even though I kind of think this argument is wrong, but I'm trying to get you to go along with it, right? If that's the case, then you don't really have alternate possibilities. You couldn't have really acted otherwise or done otherwise than what you did. Right? Premise 3, if we cannot act otherwise than what we do, then we lack free will. So do you remember when we first started talking about free will and I said, what do we mean by free will? And I had these 4 different possibilities. Here, let me just go back to it. Free will, we usually associate these things with it, right? And right at the bottom is the one that I said was really important. This intuitive idea that you could have chosen something else. You could have done a different action than the one you did, right? That's part of what we mean by free will, at least at an intuitive level. Can you really blame someone for an action that could not have been otherwise? Right? We tend to think that if there was no way that you could have chosen a different action, then you're not morally responsible, right? And that means you don't have free will either. Right? So this 4th one seems to be an important one, but as I said, there are 2 different ways of interpreting that statement. So keep that in mind. Right now, all I'm saying is the consequence argument uses as the 3rd premise this basic intuitive idea that free will has to involve multiple alternate possibilities, that you have genuine freedom to choose from among different choices. But if determinism is true, then there's really only one thing that you're going to do regardless of what you're thinking about. There's only one possible outcome, right? And the consequent argument is saying, well, if that's the case, right, if we can't do otherwise than what we do, then we lack free will. Free will involves being able to act other than what you decided to do. So then it would follow, if determinism is true, we lack free will. Right? So if you're one of these people that thinks you can't have free will and determinism both, you probably agree with this argument. Notice this argument doesn't say that determinism is true, and it doesn't say that free will is true. This argument is not about that. This argument just says they're not compatible. They can't both be true. Why not? Well, if determinism is true, then all human actions are causally necessitated. If human actions are causally necessitated, then there are no alternate possibilities. But you need alternate possibilities for free will. So, if determinism is true and all our actions are determined, then we don't have free will. Yeah, straightforward. Any problems with it? Need for clarification? So I'm just going to say, I'm going to insert myself here, my own commentary. The real problem is number 3. If we cannot act otherwise than what we do, we lack free will. You might agree with that in one sense, but not in another, right? So that's what I talked about earlier. There's 2 different ways of interpreting that statement. So premise 3 is a little bit shaky. Okay. That's all I'm going to say for now. But this argument is just trying to say free will and determinism, they can't both describe what the world is like. Right? If we have free will, determinism must be false somehow. Or if everything is determined, then we just don't have free will. So basically, take your pick, right? If you agree with this argument, then you're going to be a libertarian or a hard determinist. Alternate realities, alternate possibilities and realities, we can think of those in the same way. Except, well, I would have to say, for philosophers, we use what's called modal language, where we talk about possible universes. And that just means a possibility, right? So take any kind of free will action. Okay, you can choose to go bring some soup to your sick grandmother, or you can choose to go to the beach, right? If that's a free will choice, that means there's a possible universe where you go visit your grandmother, and there's a possible universe where you go to the beach. Okay? This argument is just saying that if determinism is true, there's only one possible universe. So I don't know if that translates to what you're thinking of a reality, but it could use that same language, okay? So this is saying if determinism is true, then there's only one possible universe for your actions. It would always result in the same thing. So, someone like Gary Watson actually is a libertarian, would say there are these multiple realities. There really are these multiple possible universes. Yeah, with the exact same setup, and that's where the problem lies, right? But now we're getting in really deep, right? Because, is it the same setup or not? That's the issue, right? So if we imagine you at that moment of deciding, grandma or beach, if you're an incompatibilist and you believe in free will, that means there are 2 genuine choices. Either one of them could happen. You could go to the beach, you could end up going to your grandma. Even if you are exactly the same person at the moment of that choice. That is the part that I find unbelievable, right? I feel like if you load up all the initial circumstances, including your own psychological profile, then if you're the type of person who chooses grandma, that's what you're going to choose, right? And it kind of is weird to think that you might be that person and then end up going to the beach instead, even though your psychological profile is exactly the same in both of these possible universes. Getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, that's okay. So far, all we got is they can't both be true. Right? That's basically what it's saying. Determinism means there aren't really these possible universes where you're doing something different. These alternate realities where you could have done this rather than that. Right? It's saying determinism sort of rules that out. Determinism says there's only one possible set of worlds. And that's the one that has you causally necessitated by the past doing the actions that you're doing. So that's all this argument really establishes. It does not say that free will exists or that determinism is true. It just says they can't both be true, right? Based on the premises of the argument. But, the argument is only as good as its premises, right? This is a valid argument. If the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. But the premises might not be true, right? Now let's tie this as well to moral responsibility, because that's the big thing, right? We hold one another accountable because we think, hey, you could have chosen something different. You could have made a different choice. And when we're convinced that someone could not have made a different choice, in many cases we would say, okay, well then I understand why you did it and I don't hold you morally accountable, right? In certain kinds of cases anyway. So this argument says, well, we're only morally responsible for actions that could have been otherwise. Again, that's part of the thinking when you blame someone for something, right? You think they're blameworthy because they made the wrong choice, meaning they could have made a different choice, but they didn't, right? That's part of it. So that's true, then we're only morally responsible for actions that really could have been different than what they were. This is what's called, what I referred to earlier, as the principle of alternate possibilities. I call it the moral principle of alternate possibilities. The second premise is, if determinism is true, then our actions could never have been otherwise. That does seem to be what determinism says, in a very strict reading of could have done otherwise. Of course, determinism is fine if you say your action could have been otherwise if the initial conditions were different, right? So again, if determinism is true, then the behavior of this pen could never be any different. Yes, but only if it's exactly the same, right? Even if there's a slight difference, then it's going to fall somewhere else. So number two, again, it's ambiguous, right? What do you mean by could have been otherwise? You mean if the initial conditions are exactly the same? Well, in that case, yeah, determinism says if the initial conditions are exactly the same, right? If the physical conditions are like this, then it's always going to fall like that. And if you are in that particular psychological framework, in that particular situation, then your action is not going to be any otherwise either, right? It's going to be fully determined by that specific set of circumstances. So then it follows, if determinism is true, then we are never morally responsible for our actions. Right? That's a big deal. Right? Because again, this is not saying determinism is true, and it's not saying that we have free will. It is simply saying, watch what happens if determinism is true. Determinism destroys the idea of free will. And without free will, we can't really make a distinction between morally blameworthy acts and morally non-blameworthy acts, right? We can't really make that distinction that we ordinarily do between free will actions and non-free will actions. And that would be a huge problem. We would not really be able to assign moral responsibility. Right? We could no more be held responsible or be told that we should have done something different, no more than this pen could be held responsible for simply following along the course that it does. It's all completely necessitated and predetermined. Right? You can't hold a pen responsible for where it lands. It is simply doing what it must do given the physical nature of the universe and given the state of the universe right now and the universe and the laws of nature. It would be the same thing for human actions, right? This argument is saying if determinism is true, then we can't really hold anyone morally accountable, because to hold someone morally accountable is to say that they could have and should have done something different, right? Have you heard that ought implies can, right? If you tell someone that they should have done something, that implies that they could have, right? If they couldn't have done the action, how can you tell them that they should have done it? It makes no sense, right? And this is basically saying determinism tells you that there's a whole bunch of things you couldn't have done. In fact, the only thing you could have done is the thing you did do. So how can you be held morally responsible then if determinism is true, right? You see the problem? So for some people, I think some people almost take this conclusion and then work backwards to try to disprove determinism, right? Because it's such an unpalatable thing. It's such a hard pill to swallow, right? Because on the one hand, you might think determinism is true, but on the other hand, that's a that makes things very difficult, right? In terms of moral responsibility, that would change our entire way of dealing with one another. This very entrenched way of thinking. Morality. It's something that's very important, and again, not just morality, but legality as well. How do we then change what happens in the courts? Did my audio just go out? Can you hear me, and is everything okay? I just had some weird messages pop up. Can you confirm if you can hear me? It looks like I'm disconnected on my end. I can't tell. To the people just watching the video later, I somehow got disconnected from the class, so I'm trying to get back into it, but it's not working. Okay, it happened again. The next time it happens, if it's just going to keep on happening, then we can just stop. I'll just finish doing it on my own. So next time it happens, you can just go ahead and leave because it's too annoying. Yeah, it's been happening a lot lately. Yeah. So, like I said, if this happens again, I don't want to keep doing this. If this happens again, I'll just X out of the meeting and I'll finish the presentation and I'll just upload it so you can look at it later, okay? Yeah, it's sudden link, isn't it? Yep. Yeah. I have sudden link as well. I'll never go back to AT&T though. They are horrible, horrible corporation. AT&T just really just lied to me. It's just incredible what AT&T did. Anyway. Yeah, sudden unlink, exactly, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to quickly keep going here. So if you're one of these people that thinks they're incompatible, and you think, well, it's free will that I think is real, right? Either because you really experience it that way, or because you don't want it to be false, right? Because you believe in moral responsibility, right? If you think free will exists and that's not compatible with determinism, then you're a libertarian. Not a libertarian in the political sense. It means something different here. So the argument we just looked at, the consequence argument, that establishes that they're not compatible. Why should you think free will exists? Well, for one, it seems like it, right? It does. It feels like it, at least, right? When you don't think about determinism or anything like that, when you're just thinking about your own behavior, it feels like you have free will, right? I mean, I could raise the left hand or the right hand, and it seems totally up to me. Right? I feel like I have free will with regard to that. I feel like it's not set in stone which one it's going to be, right? It feels that way, certainly, right? We experience ourselves as free, rational agents who are choosing from genuine alternate possibilities. Uh, of course, okay, which one is it going to be? Okay, it was that one. Right hand. I feel like it was my free will. Um, so you might say, well, then, a lot of times we go by appearances unless we have really good reason to believe otherwise, right? So we looked at skeptical scenarios like you're dreaming or something like that. And one of the solutions we had to that was to say, well, but it doesn't seem like I'm dreaming. And you can go by appearances unless there's some reason to think that it's more probable that you're being deceived, right? So in this case, we could do the same thing. We could say, well, it definitely seems like we have free will. It's going to take a lot for me to be convinced that I don't have free will, right? That might be your approach here. So you might say the premise number true is true. Well, just sort of by default. That's what it looks like. Why think any other? Why think differently, right? And also because, like I said, moral responsibility only makes sense if it's true. It seems to make sense to hold one another morally accountable. It seems to make sense that we would say a murderer did something wrong and deserves to go to jail, or if I slap you because I don't like your face, then it makes sense for you to say that I'm a bad person, or there's at least something very wrong and rotten with my personality, right? So free will goes hand in hand with moral responsibility and everyday types of evaluation. So unless we want to come up with a whole way of explaining why we're so mistaken about this, why don't we just assume that what we have been thinking is true is true? We have free will. We are morally responsible agents. And if that conflicts with determinism, well, so much the worse for determinism then, right? That's the idea. So this is going to appeal to people who understand intuitively free will very well, but perhaps are not entirely convinced by determinism. You see how that would work, right? If you've already convinced they can't both be true, but you're more intuitively aligned with the idea that we have free will, then it just seems to be the upshot, right? That free will exists and determinism is false. Right? We have this intuitive sense of ourselves as morally responsible, rational agents, right, who can freely choose from among different alternatives, who can be held responsible for making that choice. None of that makes sense if determinism is true, right? Says the libertarian. Therefore, the libertarian says, determinism must simply be false, or at least it's not true with regards to human beings, right? The libertarian is not going to say, of course, that the entire universe is not governed by any deterministic laws. Usually libertarians are fine saying that atoms are largely determined and things like that. It just means that human beings are a special case. And again, this is why classic libertarianism goes along with the idea of an immaterial soul, right? Because then you can suddenly imagine that there's something outside the physical world that's determining the physical behavior. So not all physical things can be explained in terms of physical events then, right? You still have the psychological problem to deal with. But for now, I'm just trying to motivate libertarianism, right? Just trying to show you why someone might be a libertarian. Well, free will seems to exist, and we have this hugely important, very socially dynamically rich set of practices that have to do with moral blame and moral praise, which are thrown completely out of the window if determinism is true. So the libertarian argues we should take things at face value, and if something seems to make that less credible, then it's probably that thing's problem, right? So it's probably determinism that's the problem on this view. Right. Yeah, how do you really know, right? Because that's the problem. It's kind of a funny thing. Like I said, even if you suppose that libertarianism is true and there really are possible alternatives, yet what unfolds in reality is just one set of events, right? So it almost turns into a kind of a mindless, or sort of not mindless, but sort of an empty word game to say it could have been otherwise, when in fact the whole entire course of the universe is going to be one way. Doesn't matter if that way was determined or not. If there's only one real possibility, only one possibility that gets realized, then what does it even matter? But yeah, it's also the epistemological problem of how can you judge that an action was possible, right? I mean, it's the libertarian will say something like, well, how do you judge that it's possible for you to raise either your left hand or your right hand? Well, you just know it, right? You experience it from the inside. I know it's like, at least I feel that way. So I'm trying to be a libertarian here a little bit. It does feel that way. It's a genuine possibility that this one will go up, and it's a genuine possibility that this one can go up. It's just up to me to choose, right? Yeah, in terms of what's possible. And here we go back to philosophy of mind as well, right? Where we have these problems of conceivability, metaphysical possibility, physical possibility, logical possibility, right? There's all these possibilities that we can talk about, and they're not all the same. Right? So just being able to think of an alternate possibility doesn't mean it's really possible, right? Yeah. Yeah, in your own thoughts. Yeah, that's certainly what determinism is going to say, right? That even your own thoughts are determined by previous events. Yep. Yeah. So what does that kind of free will look like? Like the libertarian who says we have free will and free will is incompatible with determinism, so determinism is false. Okay. So this has changed a little bit more recently. There are different ways of spelling out libertarian free will. I'm just going to focus on the classic one. This is the classic notion of free will. It is definitely the one that is most at home with dualism and a traditional religious kind of a point of view as well. Because notice again, if determinism is true and there is no moral responsibility, does it really make sense to say that Adam and Eve deserve their punishment and therefore human beings millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years later getting cancer and things like that? That all makes sense because it's a just system where you're getting punished for for wrong behavior. Well, none of that would make any sense, says the incompatibilist anyway, right? It wouldn't really make any sense if Adam and Eve couldn't really have done anything different from what they did, right? You might say Adam and Eve had their psychological profile that was completely determined by what kinds of beings God made them, right? What kind of beings did God create? And then what kinds of experiences did those beings have up to that moment of having a snake talk to them, right? Well, you might think it's sort of inevitable. They are the kinds of beings that they are at that moment, their psychological profile. There's no way that they would have not listened to the snake, given what kind of people they were at that moment. So, right, so you might say, unless we have libertarian free will, none of that really makes sense. It does not make sense that all of humankind, including innocent babies, would get punished for someone's behavior, even though they couldn't have helped that behavior. So this is why libertarianism is sort of necessary for some of these religious ideas, some of these religious ways of explaining the world, right? The ones that we talked about last time. You kind of need libertarian free will to make sense of that. how else would you make sense of it, right? If you don't have, if determinism is true and we don't have free will, how could you make sense out of it? On the libertarian free will view, libertarianism says we really have these alternate possibilities. Every free will action that you did could have been different from what it was. Okay? And I'm adding that clause. I mean, as you'll see, the way that I'm presenting this, I try to be as unbiased as I can, but I can only go so far. I can only present what I can understand. When I try to understand the idea of libertarian free will, this is what it looks like. Out of their own mouths, they say every free will action could have been different from what it was. That's a huge part of libertarian free will. But that would have to mean, of course, this thing that I added, even if the entire universe and your own psychological state were exactly the same at the time of your choice. So it would have to mean that, think of any free will choice that you made. To say that you could have chosen differently is to say that there's a possible universe where you're exactly the same person with the same mindset, the same psychological profile, and yet you ended up doing something different. That's what libertarian free will would have to say. Okay? And when you try to describe exactly where the freedom creeps in, this is a little bit difficult to say as well. It couldn't be between my decision and the action, right? The freedom and the indeterminism can't sneak in there, because you need the action to be a result of your own intentions, right? So there can't be a gap between what I want and then what I do. That would not be free will, right? If I want to pick apple pie and then my body goes and gets the cherry pie, I go, wait, I wanted the apple pie. That would not be free will, right? That goes against the definition of free will. So the indeterminism cannot be between what you're choosing internally and then what you're physically doing. It is rather that choice that you made internally, that mental event of making a choice in your head of what to do. That mental event was not causally necessitated by anything on this view. So the choice inevitably leads to the behavior as long as you can actually act on your choice. That's one component of free will, of course. But on this view, the other component is your choices are not determined. Right. So in a way you could say your actions are determined, but they're determined by you, right? And you are a causally free agent. So your decision was not necessitated by anything. That was completely up to you on this view. So remember, determinism says that every physical event must have been caused by previous physical events. But libertarian says, look, some physical events can only be said to have been caused by an agent, a person who's making choices, a rational person. We looked at this in behaviorism a little bit, right? Things like looking for spaghetti in the kitchen. You have to have some sort of reference to mental states, to intentions and desires and beliefs. So there are some physical events that you can only explain in terms of an agent. Right? This is the libertarian talking. So, for example, if you say that someone picked apple pie over pecan pie, it's not just that they're engaging in this physical behavior of picking up a slice of apple pie. No, if they're picking that means they have some mental states, right, where they recognize that there's an apple pie over here and a pecan pie over here. They believe that those exist, and they believe that they prefer apple pie, and they want to act on that belief, and so they get the apple pie. Right? All this idea of picking an apple pie, you have to make reference to a person, right? Just to a person with a will and a set of beliefs and so on. So it would be too crude on this view to say that every physical event is simply the result of some other physical event. right? On this view, there are some things, mental states, that are not simply physical events. Now, notice I told you we'd be getting back to philosophy of mind, right? So you can see someone who's thinking this is probably not going to be a mind-brain identity theorist or a physicalist or anything like that, right? Because on both physicalism, on functionalism, and mind-brain identity theory, we can indeed think everything boils down to brain states and brain events, and so it would be simply events causing one another on that view. But not on this view, right? Libertarian says if you really analyze certain kinds of actions, you have to make reference to an agent, right? And so on that view, when you pick an apple pie, the physical behavior of getting that piece of pie, eating it, that was caused by your choice, the choice of the agent, not some physical event, rather a choice of an agent. And that choice is non-physical and undetermined. Your choice stands outside of the causal chain in which all the physical things in the world stand, right? So the libertarian will say, yes, all these physical things around you obey physical laws, but your bodily behavior is at least partly caused by your choices. And your choices, according to this view, are not determined, right? They are sort of self-originating, right? This chain begins with you, whereas all other physical chains can be traced to prior physical chains, right? If you think of like a Rube Goldberg device, those where you have a candle burning, and the candle slowly burns this string, and then when the string gets burnt, something falls, and that falls on something else, and then the ball flies in the air, lands on something else, then rolls down something, hits something else. You see, there's a whole physical chain of events, completely causally determined, right? So if you set up that Rube Goldberg device again, it'll do the same thing as long as everything is in place. It'll do it over and over. You have all these physical events leading to other physical events, and of course you can set it all up to you can trace it back to the person who set it up. Okay, you can trace all physical events to other physical events, but not so for human choices. Human choices on this view are self-originating. They end with you, the agent, right? So you, the agent, are not being causally necessitated on this view to make that choice. It is completely up to you. That's libertarianism, right? So again, I'm trying to make it sound as good as I can. Okay. So summing up libertarianism, we'll look at some problems for it too. Right now I just wanted to sort of state it and see what's attractive about it, right? So it's a philosophical account that really tries to explain what we already take ourselves to believe ordinarily, right? It's sort of a common sense view, or at least it tries to be. It tries to accommodate these intuitions that we have, our folk theory about ourselves, and our ability to choose, our apparent ability to choose from among different options, and then the way in which we assign moral responsibility based on whether or not we actually had a choice, right? So that's its main appeal. If you have that sort of everyday point of view, then libertarianism is going to sound very comfortable and nice, right? Because it means, yes, you have free will in the way that you thought you did, and that makes you morally responsible, and your actions are not just predetermined by the past. It's up to you whether you do them, and if you do something wrong, then you're morally accountable for it. Right? That's the appeal of libertarianism. And it is appealing, right? I mean, it does correspond to most of our ordinary ways of thinking. It does not really challenge us anyway, right? And so this is actually an appeal for your theory. One thing you might think about when you think about philosophical theories is how big of an error theory they are committed to. right? Error theory means that human beings, by and large, are making a huge mistake about something, right? So, if you're a hard determinist, for example, and you deny any sense of free will, you are committed to an error theory, right? Determinism implies that human beings are wrong about the idea of free will, and we just don't have it, right? So determinism, hard determinism, involves an error theory. Libertarianism does not to the same extent, right? It tries to appeal to our common sense notions. It tries to accommodate what we already believe. And so that is appealing, right? Of course, it only works if determinism is really false and if determinism and free will really are incompatible. Right? Both of those things can be challenged, right? And an error theory is not necessarily a bad thing. Lots of theories entail error theories, especially at first. Think of evolution, right? Think of Darwin and the huge amount of pushback he had originally because it went contrary to what everyone thought, right? Evolutionary theory has an error theory in it, right? But that's okay, right? So the mere fact that hard determinism has an error theory does not automatically mean libertarianism is correct. But it is a nice thing about libertarianism that it does not leave us with an error theory and therefore also something else to explain, because you'd have to explain how it is that we can be so fundamentally mistaken about a crucial concept that we use in everyday practices, right? So it is something. It is an issue. Okay. What are the problems with libertarianism? Well, one is this idea of choices, right? I kind of gave you this picture. Well, let me just draw it really quick. I should have had this up on here, but I realized I didn't. Okay, so, right, this is the model, right? According to free will, according to libertarianism, your choice determines your behavior. Okay, that's fine. There is determinism here, right? If it's a free will choice, then having the intention and then acting on it is enough to bring about the effect. So there's no indeterminacy here. It is rather over here. What determines your choice? And libertarians say nothing. Choices are outside of any kind of causal chain. They are not caused by anything. Right? That means they're not causally explainable either. But that's really weird, isn't it? Right? What explains your decisions? When you made that internal choice to go to the beach rather than to visit grandma, or when you chose the apple pie over the pecan pie, is there no explanation for those decisions that you made? Can't we at least say something like, in many cases, the apple pie person is going to pick apple pie because they like apple pie better? That's part of their psychological profile, right? So isn't there a way that you can explain those choices? Isn't there a causal story that you can tell? Isn't it the case that the person who hates pecan pie and always chooses apple pie, isn't there some sort of psychological explanation for that? Either in terms of early childhood experiences with different kinds of pie or just genetic predispositions. What, the choices just sort of pop in your head? And if this involves some sort of non-physical agent, a soul, does the soul just sort of pop out these choices randomly? Hey, this is where I shrug at libertarianism. It's all good and well to say that freedom means, free will means standing outside of a causal chain, because it kind of sounds right? Because determinism means everything is inside a causal chain, and free will, intuitively you might say, okay, well that means you're outside of that causal chain. But now when we imagine what that's really like, and you imagine, well, where is the chain broken? And it's not broken between my actions and my decisions, right? My decisions lead to my actions. But where do my decisions come from? I don't know what the libertarian answer to that is. What can it be except for it comes from who you are as a person? Right? It comes from your psychological profile. And your psychological profile, the determinist will point out, is determined. It is subject to determinism. Yeah. So if they're just sort of randomly generated, well, that's kind of an awkward thing, right? That means your choices are not connected to your character or your understanding as of yourself. You see how problematic that would be? Now, usually you understand yourself as a certain kind of person. And yes, it's possible to go against type every now and then. There's nothing wrong with that. Determinism isn't saying you're always going to do exactly the same thing in similar circumstances. No, it's not true. Just like determinism doesn't say that the pen will always fall right there in slightly similar circumstances. No, if there's even a slight difference in the way this is angled, of course the pen will fall somewhere different. Right? So, on this view, then, it'd be very strange if you find yourself behaving in ways that are not tied to your character or your psychological profile as you normally are. Right? If you suddenly start behaving completely out of character, that seems to be problematic. That seems to raise issues about your free will. Right? This is what you see in cults, for example, right? There's a little bit of a gray area as to whether or not we'd call that a lack of free will once you've been indoctrinated. But you start making choices that have to do with what the organization says you should do or what the leader says you should do. And your behaviors become disconnected from your own actual psychological profile. Now, maybe that's a bad example. Just imagine just every day, just you start behaving in ways that are not consistent with your own character and your own understanding. You would be worried. You'd be finding yourself behaving in ways that you don't actually intend, right? Or maybe you did intend them, but those intentions are not tied in any way to your psychological profile. That, to me, seems worrying, right? So the idea that your choices are causally disconnected from anything actually seems problematic to me, right? Normally, you understand your own behaviors and your own choices in terms of your own psychological history and your own psychological makeup. If those choices are just causally disconnected, then there's no way to make sense of your own choices anymore, right? Which I find odd. Now, I might just be misunderstanding libertarianism, okay? Now, I have studied this, right? But you end up somewhere. Wherever you end up, you're not quite understanding where somebody else is coming from, right? So the libertarian might have similar problems with determinism or hard determinism or compatibilism. This is one of my issues with libertarianism. I don't really get the idea that a choice could be causally disconnected and stand outside of the causal chain. Even though it sounds like you should have that for free will in this extreme sense of it, this radical sense of free will, of standing outside of causal determinism altogether. When you really think about it, it starts to look kind of weird. Okay. It sounds kind of chaotic, right? Because, again, imagine that your choices, the choices that you make in life, imagine that those choices you make are suddenly not connected to who you are as a person. That there's no connection between them. That sounds like a kind of a schizophrenia or something like that. That does not sound like you end up with a free rational agent. It sounds like you have somebody who just has weird impulses all the time. Right? That sounds like the opposite of free will. Ironic, right? The more I think about this, indeterminism is a greater threat to free will than determinism is. If they're not just randomly generated, right, then there's got to be some sort of causal explanation. Where did those choices come from? If there's a reason that you have those choices rather than other choices, then we're back to determinism. Okay? You're perceiving, yeah, maybe even that. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that, Parker. Yeah. That it may seem to be in line with your inconsistent behavior. I'd have to think about all that a little bit more. Those might be good points, but sometimes I have to be honest and say, it takes a while to process abstract philosophical thoughts and really come up with an opinion. So I'd have to think about exactly what you're saying a little bit over there, Parker, but I think you might be onto something. The whole idea of agent causation, right? The libertarians said, look, you can only explain certain behaviors in terms of agents. You need agents to explain events. So we can't reduce it all down to just events causing other events. It can't be like that for human behavior because we are agents. We are not simply physical events. Right? We have perhaps souls or something like that. But if physicalism is true, right? If when we looked at philosophy of mind, let's say functionalism, a physicalist kind of functionalism that ties mental states to brain states, to functional brain states, right? If you're like that, then, this idea of agent causation, it's fine. We can talk about agents, but that's just a higher level talk about lower level stuff, right? Down here, where it's all atoms, it's all just physical causation. So it doesn't matter that at higher levels of complexity, we can talk about these patterns that we call human agents and human behavior. But if physicalism is correct, then all that ultimately just reduces down to just physical stuff happening at the atomic level, right? Or at least at the very small level of just physical stuff happening. Let's see, Descartes' evil demon. In what way? What reminds you of it? Certainly all this talk, if we're doing philosophy of mind, of course it's all going to remind us of that. If physicalism is true, then all your intentions, all your choices, all your decisions, they can be explained in terms of brain states or brain function, right? However you want to tell the physicalist story, right? We looked at these different ways of looking at it. You can get lost. What's the expression? You can not see the forest for the trees, right? Let's just take a general physicalist approach. That means all these mental events, mental capacities that we have are ultimately the result of physical processes. Right? So the whole idea of agent causation does not help out the libertarian. And if physicalism is true, then determinism is true. Put a pin in that, though, because quantum indeterminacy raises a problem for that. Okay, I see what you're saying, Parker. Yeah. And we have this problem all over again, right? The mind-body interaction problem. If the choosing agent, right? If the thing that makes these choices that gets translated into physical behavior, if that's actually happening in a soul, I keep pointing in here, but in here I've got a brain. Okay, there's no soul in here. Certainly not on Descartes' view. A soul is not located somewhere. It's immaterial, right? So we have that problem all over again. If choices originate in an immaterial soul, how do those immaterial choices that are not located anywhere over here end up being translated into human behavior? The libertarian, at least if they're going to go this route, the dualism route, has that problem all over again, right? How do you account for mind-body interaction? How do you account for the fact that mental states end up being behaviors, actions, right? A decision gets translated into an action. If decisions exist in this non-physical realm, how in the world is that crossing over into the physical realm, making me behave in a certain way, right? So there's that problem as well. This all has to do with physicalism, of course, right? If you're not a physicalist, those things might not be problems, right? We could also simply take an opposite approach. You'll find this in philosophy many times. It just depends on what your beginning premises are, right? So, look, you could agree with the libertarian that free will and determinism are not compatible. They can't both be true. You could agree with that. But instead of focusing on free will, you might focus on determinism. Right? You might say, I don't know about free will, but I think determinism is true. Right? The success of science has shown us that this must be true, and metaphysically it makes more sense. Logically it makes more sense, right, to think that events are explainable in terms of previous physical causes. And that's just how we see the world. So determinism must be true. And of course, if that's the case, then we don't have free will. Right? So that's a problem for libertarianism. Determinism is a problem, right? So whereas the libertarians said they're not compatible, free will is true, therefore determinism is false, this view is flipping it around. Agreed with the first premise. Second premise is, but hey, determinism was the one that's true, so therefore we don't have free will. All right, so determinism is a problem for free will. We haven't shown so far, right? The libertarian had not really shown that determinism is false in a direct way. They did it in an indirect way by showing that, well, look, if we have free will and we think we do, then determinism can't be true. And since we do think we have free will, determinism can't be true. But it's not evaluating the idea of determinism on its own terms, right? So that's a third problem for determinism. Okay, we're just about done here. I won't make you stay very late. We just recap here, and then I'll quickly introduce hard determinism. So let me go back to the chart overall so you can see where we're at. All right, free will. We've looked at the different definitions or different things that we associated with it, right? We have a very loose definition of 4 kind of criteria. One of the most important criteria is the idea that you could have done otherwise. For any free will action, you could have chosen a different action. Okay? And that ties to morality. Right? We hold people morally accountable only if they could have chosen to do something different. Determinism says every event that happens is causally necessitated. It is made to happen by previous actions. Right? The entire state of the universe right now is going to determine exactly what's going to happen next. And that includes physical behavior. Right? So then you have a choice. If determinism is true, does that mean you have free will? Or does it mean you don't have free will? And vice versa. Well, if you think they're mutually incompatible, if you think you can't have determinism and free will, or if you think you can't have free will and determinism, well, you're an incompatibilist. And if you're an incompatibilist, you're either going to be a libertarian who thinks free will exists and determinism is false, or you will be this next category that we're going to look at, a hard determinist. Someone who thinks determinism is true and therefore free will is false. Therefore, we do not have free will. Rather. Okay? So it just flips it. It flips the argument around, right? It's just like this. So you can compare the two. Oh wait, I didn't compare them here. Okay. it's pretty simple. The argument for determinism, all you really need is determinism is true. If determinism is true, then there is no free will. Right? That's basically what this argument is saying. Straightforward, right? The problem for that is, of course, right now here you can compare and contrast the two arguments. This is what I was saying earlier. You can say that it's a problem for libertarianism because you can have this argument on the left. But likewise, there's a problem for hard determinism, which is this argument on the right. Right? Each of these arguments has a conclusion that contradicts one of the premises that the other one has. Do you see that? See how easy it is to come up with an argument if you already have certain ideas in place. You see? So how do you pick between these two arguments? They agree about the first premise, that it seems as though the cat is already out of the bag, right? Depending on what your second premise is. You see the problem here? So many arguments will be like this. We'll see this in arguments for and against the existence of God as well, right? We looked at the problem of evil. Someone who's not a theist, an atheist, can look at all the suffering that exists in the world and come up with an inductive argument that says it does not look at all like there's a benevolent being watching over everything, making sure everything is fair and nice, so therefore there probably isn't. An inductive argument against the argument against existence of God. Whereas someone who already does believe in God will think, if God exists, then there is no unjustified suffering. That means even though all this suffering exists, it must be justified in some way, even if we don't know how. Right? Your beginning premises are going to dictate how you evaluate particular arguments. It should be obvious, but it is just something worth mentioning, depending on where you start out. So we all kind of carry this filter with us in various ways. It's very difficult. I mean, you kind of have to be an individual. You have to stand somewhere. But in philosophy, you do practice taking a step back and trying to look at all the different points of view, right? So it's kind of a general kind of a problem, right? When you're evaluating arguments for and against different positions, yeah, of course, it's going to depend on what sorts of previous assumptions you have. Yeah, for sure, Parker. You could change the definition of God to be not benevolent or a deistic God who stands outside of the universe. Yeah, we'll look at that problem of definition for God as well. It's a huge problem, right? Does God exist? Well, define your God first, right? Yeah. Okay, so that's really the biggest problem with hard determinism. Is that if we have free will, then our determinism is false, right? If we do have free will, then determinism is false. And if determinism is false, then hard determinism is false. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll stop there. This is too big of a chunk to get into indeterminacy right now. Okay. Hard determinism, we went over it very quickly because it's very simple, right? Determinism, true. No free will, right? And so you could come back with that with a very simple argument and simply say, oh no, but we do have free will, so determinism is false. Right? And once you show that determinism is false, then hard determinism is false. Okay. But we've seen that you could also do that with the libertarian argument, right? They say determinism is false. Well, why is determinism false? Because we have free will. Yeah, but the hard determinists can say, no, we don't have free will, because determinism is true, and determinism and free will are not compatible. You see the back and forth? Yeah. So try to locate yourself on here somewhere, or perhaps you, unlike both of these people, right, both the libertarian and the hard determinist, both agree on that first premise. You might not agree with that first premise, right? That's what the incompatibilist is going to argue. Okay. So next time we'll we'll look at problems with hard determinism, and then we'll look at compatibilism, right? This third option that says if we understand free will correctly, determinism won't be a problem, and we don't have to choose in this way. Okay? That's all we'll do next time. Okay, that'll be it for now, unless you have any other questions or comments or concerns. Make sure you get in there and do that midterm, right? I think it's due tomorrow midnight. If I'm remembering that correctly. Other than that, have a good weekend. Oh yeah, also make sure there's a discussion this week. Okay. Psychology and determinism, where we have some of the same issues raised. What I've read so far is great. People are engaging in this in a really good way. This is usually something that we talk a lot about in class, and we take a lot longer going over all this. We're going pretty quick. It's harder to have discussions in this kind of format. Okay, thanks, bye.